In a previous video, we've taken a look at the philosopher Protagoras and what he means when he says that man is the measure of all things. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend watching that first. In this video, we're going to talk about several criticisms that have been leveled at Protagoras, mostly by Plato and Aristotle, and how he might have responded. Before we get into the criticisms, it may be necessary to do some philosophical groundwork to expand a bit on the last video's articulation of Protagoras' philosophy. It will make the criticisms leveled at Protagoras and the possible responses make more sense. To do that, I'll ask you to make sense of the following statement. There are things that are true, even though no one will ever believe them. Does that statement make sense to you? If so, you're probably thinking of truth as a property of things in the world. To you, the statement probably means that there are states of the world that are the way they are, independently of whether anyone believes them, and statements are true to the extent that they get that world right. To borrow an example from the last video, there is a way vaccines are. They either do or don't inoculate against disease, and it's possible that the truth about vaccines would still be true even if no one believed it. Protagoras, I think, would say that truths are more about how we judge statements about the world, not about whether statements align with how the world actually is. Here's a quote from philosopher Richard Rorty, who has defended a Protagorean position. We need to make a distinction, he says, between the claim that the world is out there and the claim that the truth is out there. To say the world is out there, that it is not our creation, is to say, with common sense, that most things in space and time are the effects of causes which do not include human mental states. To say that truth is not out there is simply to say that where there are no sentences, there is no truth. Truth cannot be out there, cannot exist independently of the human mind, because sentences cannot so exist or be out there. In other words, to Rorty, to give an example of truth, vaccines inoculate against disease, you must give a sentence. And to judge a sentence true is a human affair. We put it to tests and judge whether to call it true by whether they satisfy those tests. Truth is an adjective we use to say something about a statement based on our human judgment. And this is an important clarification because it will help us see how Protagoras might argue against some of the criticisms leveled against him. Let's get to those criticisms. The first criticism comes to us in a dialogue Plato wrote called the Theaetetus, where the characters Socrates and Theaetetus discuss what knowledge is and who can claim to have it. Protagoras' man is the Measure Doctrine is examined and found wanting. The first charge Plato makes against the doctrine is that it rules out the idea that any of us can attain superior wisdom. If everything everyone judges to be true is, for that reason, true, then in some sense no one is better off at judging and acquiring wisdom than others. Here's how Plato's Socrates describes it. If what every man believes as a result of perception is indeed to be true for him, if, just as no one is to be a better judge of what another experiences, so no one is better entitled to consider whether what another thinks is true or false. Plato even extends this criticism to Protagoras himself, who claims to teach the art of good judgment to others. But if all people are the measures, what gives Protagoras, or anyone, the authority to claim superior judgment? Protagoras responds later in the dialogue by saying that while everyone is indeed the measure of what they call true, wise people are wise precisely because they are skilled at bringing people towards better judgment. Protagoras then can claim wisdom because, or if he can, persuade others that his teaching are the ones they should adopt. A lawyer can only be called wise if she is skillful at convincing judges and juries towards the verdict she thinks is best. A doctor can be called wise only to the extent that his treatments are judged to work by the measures of the patients in his care. They are not wise because they get at truth, but are wise because they can persuade others to adopt beliefs that, when tried on, work better than previously held ones. In the Theaetetus, Socrates also charges that Protagoras' doctrine means effectively that no one can ever be wrong. That is, if I'm the measure of what is true, then anything I say is true, I just can't be wrong about that. While Protagoras doesn't speak directly to this objection in the Theaetetus, it's an easy one to meet. Remember earlier that Protagoras held that wise people are wise precisely because they can get others, by persuasion or demonstration, to change their beliefs to better ones. Well, clearly those instances are of people thinking one thing is true and coming to believe that they were wrong, that there are better candidates for truth in some other statement. But I suspect Protagoras would say that one can't believe one is correct and unknowingly be wrong. You could tell me and strongly believe that I'm wrong, but that's just your contention that I'm wrong against my contention that I'm right. Only until I decide to my own satisfaction by my own measure that my belief has been shown wrong. Now we get to the big one. the objection leveled both by Plato in the Theaetetus dialogue and Aristotle in his Metaphysics. Here's how Aristotle puts it. Protagoras saying man is the measure of all things means that what seems to each man is so. Then, since things seem different to different people, the same thing will be and not be. To Aristotle as Plato, this seems obviously wrong. Let's imagine a court case where we're both jurors. After appraising the evidence and hearing the prosecution and defense, I think the defendant is guilty of the murder and you think he is not. Surely, Aristotle and Plato would say, he can't both be guilty and not guilty. He can't both have killed the victim and not killed her. One of these views must be right and the other wrong. Here, we might go back to the distinction made by Richard Rorty earlier in the video. There is a way the world is, sure, but truths about the way the world is come through statements about the world, and we judge them true or false by evidence. We can't just look at the world apart from beliefs and statements about it to see what happened. We judge certain statements true or false because the evidence convinces us one way or other. Apply this to the trial where you and I disagree on the defendant's guilt. At some point, the defendant did or did not kill the victim. Unfortunately, the only way we can decide that is by looking at evidence after the fact. This is literally what a trial is for. If we could just go back in time and see what happened, trials would never be necessary. Given these cognitive limitations, the best we can do is to appraise the evidence, often circumstantial evidence, and decide for ourselves what statement, guilty or not guilty, we should call true. Looked at this way, our disagreement comes down to my conviction that the defendant is guilty and yours that he isn't. It isn't clear that this is contradictory. What Aristotle wants to do, it seems, is to point out that had we more perfect knowledge and ability to see the evidence more clearly, with none of these messy human biases and idiosyncrasies, we can transcend our beliefs about what is true with knowledge of what actually happened. But we can't, and I think that is Protagoras' point. Another answer to this charge of contradiction comes from the philosopher Joseph Margolis. Margolis points out that Plato, Aristotle, and a host of philosophers ever since operate on a model that assumes that the world is both stable and transparent. The world is there, it has some stability behind it, and we can unlock its stable secrets if we look hard enough and try hard enough. These, say Margolis, are largely assumptions that are often less argued for than assumed as premises for argument. Margolis argues that modern discoveries about the world, from evolutionary theory to quantum physics, depict a world that is much more prone to change, and disciplines from neurology to psychology also tell us that we see the world less as it is and more in whatever ways are beneficial for humans to see it. That means that rather than being stable, the world is in flux, and rather than the world being clear or transparent, it is opaque, and our view of it is as much determined by us as the world. As Margolis puts it, Protagoras may be only one among the sophists who anticipated in the boldest way these tendencies that in our time seem to have recovered what may be reasonably supposed to have been Protagoras' most salient doctrine, namely, that we may abandon invariance altogether without fear of self-contradiction or self-referential paradox. If the world changes, then all truths are contestable and provisional. Even if we agree today that vaccines inoculate against disease, this theory may be shown false tomorrow or shown not to work on newly discovered diseases. And if the world is opaque, then we should expect people to disagree about what is true at any given time. If those disagreements seem contradictory, it's because we expect that we can obtain a clear or maybe neutral view of the world to see what the real truth is. That is a view, however, that Protagoras doesn't seem to think we can obtain. The next criticism is a sophisticated, get it, sophisticated, one that Plato offers about whether the man is the measure doctrine undercuts itself or is self-refuting. It goes like this. If everyone is the measure of what is true, then when people judge this doctrine to be false, and seemingly many do, it must be false, or at least to those people. Conversely, if Protagoras tells the people who judge it false that it's true, he can only do so by saying that they are not the measure of truth here and that he, Protagoras, is. If man is the measure is the true account of how belief works, then you're saying that it is true regardless of whether people believe it, and if you're not putting it forward as true, well, then you aren't engaging in serious philosophy. Protagoras' answer is to, get this, admit it, at least in a way. Here's what he says. For I do indeed assert that the truth is as I have written. Each one of us is a measure of what is and of what is not, but there is all the difference in the world between one man and another, just in the very fact that what is and appears to one is different than what is and appears to the other. He is essentially admitting that he is actually putting forth what he judges to be true, and if others judge it not to be, if he cannot convince them otherwise, then the doctrine is as false for them as it is true for him. Philosophers will likely bristle when they hear such a response, but this gets to the heart of how different I think Protagoras' idea of philosophy was from Plato's, which is the one Western philosophy has largely inherited. To Plato and beyond, the purpose of philosophy is to use reason to find truths that are out there, universal truths rather than relative ones, permanent and stable truths rather than contingent ones. But remember the quote from Richard Rorty earlier. I think that gets at what Protagoras has in mind. The only truths we can get are relative ones, because the best we can ever do is to judge for ourselves and see what seems true by what convinces us. And if different people are convinced by different things, as seems to be the norm in the world, well, maybe philosophy should just be a bit more modest. As Protagoras might have seen it, philosophers can't discover core truths that we would all agree on if we just saw things really clearly. But what philosophers can do, and what Protagoras does with his Man in the Measure doctrine, is offer up views that we find compelling and think we can persuade others on, and see who accepts or rejects what. And if different people find different views more or less compelling, that's to be expected in a world where we are all the measures of what is true, and there's no measure greater than us. The last possible criticism to address doesn't stem from Plato or Aristotle, but arguably from the modern world. Especially in a world plagued by what we call fake news, there may be a concern that Protagoras is simply paving the way for chicanery, granting skillful speakers the license to lie to us as long as they can get us to believe their well-crafted lies. First, unfortunately, hucksters wouldn't need Protagoras' permission to disseminate their well-crafted lies. Even if Protagoras is wrong that man is the measure of all thing, lying is something liars will go on doing. But I don't think Protagoras means to sanction the idea that rhetoric should be used to tell lies. If Protagoras denies objective truth, it is the kind of truth whose opposite is falsity, not dishonesty. While we can't know what Protagoras thought about the morality of deceptive rhetoric, nothing he says need be taken as an endorsement of it. Richard Rorty made an important distinction clear in an interview. He said, "There are two questions here. I think that what people really worry about is truthfulness. They think they're being lied to all the time, and they wish that people would just tell them the truth. They just want people to say what they believe, governments to say the same things to the public that they say to the other governments, and so on. Truth, as a philosophical problem, is a question of whether true statements are representations of reality or whether the notion of representation applies to statements, and so on. As Rorty distinguishes it, there is truth, a matter of getting things right, and truthfulness, the matter of being sincere in voicing beliefs. Protagoras, I think, is dealing with, maybe attacking, the idea of truth but not necessarily of truthfulness. Getting someone to believe what you think is the best belief is different from getting someone to believe what you actually don't think to be the best belief. And even if you have, so to speak, the truth on your side, you still have to couch your argument in rhetorical terms that will persuade others. Just because people can lie using this method doesn't mean it's thereby a method of dishonesty. Protagoras' Man is the Measure doctrine is surely an interesting one. For some, it offers a way of understanding why different seemingly competent people believe wildly different things, find different arguments convincing, and show no chance of converging on large-scale agreement on what is correct to believe. For others, Protagoras is a dangerous setter in motion of a corrosive type of relativism that denies the idea that we can all ever get on the same page regarding what is true. Which of these is the most apt description of Protagoras' project? Different listeners will likely conclude differently, and that is exactly what Protagoras would have expected.